In this video, we're going to look at the through connectors that we have that snap onto DIN rail. It's the industrial way to connect two wires together or multiple wires together. Make sure that you use the 184 size screwdriver. That's important because the screw heads match up perfectly to that, and anything smaller you can tend to start messing up the heads on the screws. So this is a connector. It's you can see it's just a solid piece of metal that runs all the way through. You simply have two sides. You can put a wire in here and then clamp the wire down with the clamping action of the screw. And then the other wire that you want to connect is right here, of course, same deal. And you've made your connection between those two wires. You know, it's just how you lay things out in a cabinet is typically with these. Some things about the screwdriver itself. I mean, it's important to use this one. Even to take it to another level, though, in a setting where it really counts, you would use a torque screwdriver and torque that screw so that the threads have that pressure against themselves where the screw won't vibrate loose. So you do run into a whole thing with this connectivity where, so many times that's the simple little thing that causes the big problems on the factory floor. It's just how reliable are the connections. Did it vibrate loose? Is there a wire that's loose? And not that easy to find always, because out of the hundreds or thousands of connections, if one of them's loose, it takes time to find it. So stupid, simple stuff like that certainly means that in a real setting, you might very well be using a torque screwdriver. The other option is to have the terminal type that has a spring action. So you would put your screwdriver somewhere and relieve the spring, put the wire in, and let the spring come back and clamp the wire. And those seem like favorable to me. I don't know what all the pros and cons are, but if you can picture that spring steel sort of clamping on the wire constantly, as opposed to having to torque the threads of a screw, I might vote for the clamp. We have the screw ones, so that's fine. That's what we'll be using. And but just to let you know some of the varieties that are out there that you might run into, to release the wire in a sort of a clamping one without the screw, you have to get your screwdriver in there and sort of pry it back. I'll find some. I'll find some maybe even in this video and show you. Well, this is the ones that we're going to be using. So they actually snap onto what's called DIN rail. DIN rail comes in, sort of different varieties. It can be different thicknesses, but the DIN rail actually lays or is fastened, maybe like this to the back of the cabinet. Now, your feed-through connectors, they just snap right on. So you can see, I think the action here is just maybe put the one end on, and do you see the end with the tab? I don't know, I'm in the habit of putting that on second. So you do that, and then you just press down, and it snaps in place, okay? Just like that. Okay, it should be on there, and it'll slide. You can slide it to whatever position you want. To release, you just go to where that, little lever is, and you pry it off. So you have to do... You have to do this action here, right, with your screwdriver, right? You can see that I'm making that plastic go wider, I think. Whoop, if I can get that in the camera there. See how I'm stretching that out? That's what made it pop off the DIN rail. So whatever connections you need to make, you can do that by sliding on as many connectors as you need. One example that I'll do for you might be maybe your 24-volt supply. You need a couple points to tie to. So yellow is what we're using for 24 volts, the positive side. The gray terminals we're using for the 0-volt side of the 24-volt supply. We'll use for 120 volts, we're using black for the hot, white for the neutral, green for ground. That's, of course, standard electrical code there. But yeah, you could put multiple connectors. Right now they're just individually, there where a wire here could be connected to a wire here. But if I wanted to make sort of a bus out of this, where I bring 24 volts, positive side of the 24 volt supply could come in, and then I'd have 5 tie points that I could get 24 volts from. And the easy way to do that is just use these jumpers. So you're going to take this, and if you can see, you got 2 places I could put it, and they're the same, and it'll jumper here, or so I'm going to put them in there and press down. Now sometimes you can get jumpers, some of the older ones we had, they actually had jumpers that screwed into place. Honestly, I thought that was maybe a better way, but what do I know? I mean, these are what we have. They just press into place, and then they tie all of the blocks together. So now I have 6 tie points that are all connected. And then to keep the example going, if I wanted to add some tie points for the 0 volt side of a supply, obviously I can do that. And here's a very important point to remember. It is important, the orientation. I mean, I put all the yellow blocks on in the same orientation, whether I had to or not. But the orientation I'm talking about is they must go on like this as opposed to this. Can you see why? So, because this actually has happened. On the top, you can't really tell much difference, right? There's a problem because I've got some exposed metal here and some exposed metal here. Now they do have plastic dividers, that's true. So I mean, I could drop a plastic divider in here. It would solve the problem, and the problem, I think you can see it, right, is that metal touching and you've shorted out your power supply. That happened actually. Somebody was just happily putting these on and putting their system together, and it wasn't such an obvious problem because it was intermittent. I mean, those pieces of metal, they weren't, in their case, they weren't touching all the time. So I mean, sometimes they would bump, and I don't think it was the power supply. It was something else. That was shorting out. So it was kind of a weird, sort of exhibited itself in sort of a mysterious way. I mean, there they are at their bench trying to demonstrate their control circuit, and it's working. Call Mr. Evans over. It's not working. Mr. Evans walks away. Hey, I got it working again. It's working. Quick, come over while it's working. I come walking back. It's not working. You get the idea. I mean, something as simple as I think what we found out is even just stepping heavily on the floor, or definitely putting a hand on the bench might flex something, and these things would touch. We found the problem eventually, but there again, it wasn't that easy to find because of all the connectors. Which one's the problem? So it was a little tough to isolate. And when we finally saw that, like I said, it wasn't the power supply, but when we saw the 2 connectors that we were just ohming things out, and we're like, those should not be 0 ohms ever. And now they are, now they're not. Now they are, now they're not. And we were just wiggling stuff at that point, going, where's the loose connection? Where's the intermittent connection? What is happening? And so anyway, so lesson learned for sure for that student, I hope. And I've made a point to always, emphasize that. I think from then on. So obviously they have to go like this, or put the plastic barrier in. I mean, that would be okay too. But I think it's good practice to keep them oriented the same way. For the other reason would be when you if you need to release some of these, it's nice to have the release, on the same side. And you can decide if you like that down or you like that up, to release off the DIN rail, depending, what kind of cabinet you have or what system. So I guess one other thing to mention in this example that we have for you, I would need to jumper the 0 volt side, and something that's small but probably a nice thing to get in the habit of doing. I would put my jumper for the 0 volt side. I would put it not right across from the positive side. So in other words, I don't have another jumper here. I would not put it here. I would put it over here. Okay, over here. So not here. Don't jumper them right in the same line. Put them over here. It gives you a little more space. That's not as important with these jumpers. They well, I can see some copper sitting there, so I take that back. What happens is you cut these jumpers to length, okay? So if I cut 3 to length, and then you can buy them in 3s, so that's also a possibility. But if you're cutting them to length, there's the possibility that you have some bare copper right on the end here. And of course, I think you can see if I put the other 3 jumpers right here, I would have bare copper sitting real close to the other bare copper here. They could bump together. See, again, you'd recreate that intermittent problem. So always jumper, and then if you're going to jumper these, jumper over here. Okay, so it's simple stuff, but important stuff. So now I want to talk about actually getting the wire connection made to the terminal block. And here we are with the option of to ferrule or not to ferrule, and that's a debate that I don't know if I have the final answer to, but there's different advantages and disadvantages. So, I mean, here I have a stranded wire, 22 gauge, and here I have a ferrule that I can use. But let's show you the stranded wire could go right into that clamp. It is okay to do that. One thing that's a little tricky is you definitely don't want to clamp and have the clamping action fixing to the insulation. You need so the risk of not using a ferrule might be, one of the things might be that you don't have as good of a feel for the depth that you're putting that wire in, and it might disappear. If you have 100 or 1,000 of these to do, the ferrule makes life easy because it'll come in and stop short if you have the right ferrule matched to the right. It has to be matched to the wire gauge, but also matched to the terminal block, and then the ferrule will drop right in. Let me show you that. It'll drop right in there just to the right depth, and the clamping action will be all on the metal. It won't grab some of the plastic, which can be a problem because if it's clamping on the plastic, or in this case in the wire, if it's clamping on the insulation, then the wire might be a little bit loose and be intermittent. So the ferrule does make life easy that way. Otherwise, you're kind of eyeballing it, or I guess the strip length. You could do that. You'd have to, that would work fine too. A third option, you could dip this in some solder pot and you could tin the wire and clamp it. But I mean, I don't think that's done. No, I mean, I think the solder is another whole topic. So from what I know, and I'm not saying I know it all here, the bare wire and then that clamping action clamps right on the copper, bites into it. And that's one way to go. I guess I'll just throw pros and cons back and forth as I think about them. One other bad thing about not using a ferrule is when you have it clamped, the pivoting action of the wire, if there is any, will tend to be right on the metal, and that will break faster than if you have a ferrule on. It will help with that issue, because if you see the wire will go in, and then there's this cup that comes up over the insulation, and ideally if you have exactly the right cup and the right wire insulation thickness and the right gauge, so this is good gauge, the 22 gauge is good for the metal part of the ferrule, and then the cup's a little loose here, but what I want to get across here is the pivoting now is back on the insulation. So the insulation is helping that bend radius not be real sharp, as opposed to bend radius right on the wire and it wiggles right back and forth. It can break faster. It'll break faster than if then then if I'm bending with the insulation included, I mean, that can still break too, but not as quickly. So I mean, there's all these little pros and cons. So I think the other thing that's always in the mix as far as the decision of to ferrule or not to ferrule is how well. Probably the most important thing is the reliability of that insert point and that clamping action staying there. So if it's going to clamp onto the wire and not get loose, better than the ferrule, there would be a pro for the wire. Or if it's going to crush that ferrule and get a nice bite and maybe not come loose with the ferrule, maybe that's the case. Those are some questions that are sometimes, I think, hard to answer. I mean, you have to really get into some intricate details, I think, to make that call. But what you're really looking for, of course, is a connection that won't become loose. I mean, that's the bottom line. So those are some choices. I mean, for a lot of our stuff, it's temporary. It really doesn't matter. We're just doing the exercise to get the wiring exercise to show what the different ways to wire things are. So we're not so concerned. We're going to wire it and then just take it right apart again. So, I mean, I'm going to say for all our exercises in the lab, don't use ferrules. That would just be wasting ferrules. Bare wire's fine. It's just getting undone anyway. In the project lab, there'll be times where we do say, let's use ferrules because this thing's going to stay permanent. If you want to do some ferrules and just for practice, if you haven't done any, I mean, you can strip the wire long enough, and then so that I like to have confidence that I have the whole length of the ferrule there. And I don't know if you can see, there's a little bit of wire sticking out. It doesn't matter how much wire sticks out. It can be lots because you can always just nip it off with a flush cutters right there. So these ferrules, you need to know what size they are. These are 0.5, so I'm using the smallest die, and it's a real simple crimp. So that's one nice thing about ferrules. They're not difficult. You just put it in the die and crush it, There are different types of crimps. This one's sort of I don't know what you call it. It's sort of a flat squashing there. Some come in from, 4 points or even 6 points, and some are square. This one tends to be like a flat crush. So, there's lots of differences to consider. I know I got a crimper that on Amazon that came in. It was cheap. It came in on 4 points, I think, and I thought, oh, that's cool. It kind of gives me a square crimp. It wasn't cool though because it bit into the metal too much, and the ferrules just broke very easily. So you have to be careful that the crimp doesn't compromise the ferrule. All I did there was nip off the extra little bit of conductor on the outside of that ferrule. But yeah, let me zoom in here. I'll zoom in a little bit. There's so many little things that come to mind. I wanted to show you another thing. If the crimp is not symmetrical, and I would say this is not exactly right. It's kind of a flattened crimp, So I don't know. For me, I think it's valid. I tend to pay attention when I'm putting that in. I want to keep the flattened crimp. I want to keep it flat so that when the vise action clamps down on it, I need it to be the thinnest, the flattest. And the reason I'm saying that is if I put it in sort of on end like this, my worry is you'll squeeze down on it with the vise, but I don't have a real good idea of what's happening inside there. It might squeeze on it, and then this thing might over time sort of flatten a little more and then be loose and fall out. You just don't know exactly what's happening in there if you tend to smash it, sort of on the vertical. I would say you crimped it flat, so clamp it flat. You know what I mean? I don't know how valid that is. I think it's valid though. I always do it. Surprise. So yeah. Now that's another thing. If you have like a round crimp or a square crimp, maybe there's some other, you wouldn't have to worry so much about that. But the flat crimp, I tend to pay attention to that. Let's see. I think what else I have here. So yeah. So they are just connectors. You know, some people even ask, you know, think they're more than that. They're just a straight through connection. Now you can get different types that stack up maybe, and you know, they get more than one, you know, maybe there's two straight through and so on and so on. So I mean, there's lots of varieties, but this is the basic starting point for feed through connectors, and just a way to make connections. And even just from this video, I think you can see, yeah, it's simple, it's just a connector, but there's lots of things to pay attention to, you know, to not have intermittent shorts, like we said, to have a good amount of torque on that screw. But we don't have torque screwdrivers, so it's a little tricky. I mean, you want to tighten it, but you don't want to overdo it and strip the threads. Again, it's not so critical because our exercises are just temporary. You know, we're not trying to do the permanent build. But if we were doing permanent stuff, yeah, torque screwdriver all the way, no doubt. And the reason there are so many little things to pay attention to, even though it's ultra simple, this component, if you want to call it that, it is because it seems like 90% of the problems you run into are connectivity. You know, there's some kind of connection that failed, so yeah. So that's why we pay attention to even though it's super simple, we focus on it. And maybe before we wrap up the video, I can show you, while we're talking about clamping action on a wire to make a connection. I mean, we can take a quick look. These are the contacts that we'll use for our switches and buttons, and they bolt right on to whatever actuator you want to use, a push button, you know, a switch or whatever. This is the bolting action that bolts it on to the actuator, and then you have, again, clamping action with two screws here and here. Now in this case, though, of course, it's not a feed through connector. This is not connected to this. It will be when you press the switch if it's normally open. So you'll see the plunger action comes from this little black tab. That when you press on the actuator, whether it's a button or a switch, it'll push that in. You can see it from the back. You see, I don't mean to be pushing that, but this comes up. I don't know if you can see that. Let me push that. So do you see the? Let me see here. If you can see, there it is. You can see that black plunger moving. That's one way to see that the actuator is doing its job. The other thing, though, that does is you can stack these. So if I wanted to put another contact here, this red is a normally closed contact, which means the two screw terminals will be closed normally, but when the plunger is activated or actuated, the contacts open. So this is normally closed, the red is. But what I was getting to is you can stack these, see, and here's the mechanical screw that connects them. But now the actuator will actuate this plunger here, and this plunger will actuate this plunger. So you can stack these out at, you know, however many you want, however deep the cabinet is, I guess. But you know, you don't go crazy. I mean, you don't get silly after a while. But you know, 2 or 3 sometimes happens. 2 or 3 stacked. It is the same idea with the screw. This screwdriver might not be ideal for these. Actually, it's not. I mean, you can cheat, but I mean, I don't know. I hate to tell you that. It's just a little bit of luck that our little 184 size screwdriver fits in sort of a half of a slot there. I mean, this is a Phillips head. It can take a straight blade. I mean, ideally, we should use the larger screwdrivers for this. So, I mean, I shouldn't have let you in on that little thing that people cheat. Most important thing is you don't want to mess up the tip on the 184 because it's a little bit, a little bit vulnerable if you start doing heavier screws like this. So use the larger screwdriver. But it is, I'm cheating here just because I don't have the larger screwdriver handy. The clamping action is right here again. It will receive your wire or your ferrule right here. Okay, and once again, it's one thing comes to mind. If you had 2 wires, I don't know. I think I shouldn't have. I don't have to tell you this, right? Put one here and put one here, right? Don't put them both in the same spot. I always like it if I do. I mean, that distributes the clamping force equally. They're made to be all right with just one though. So I mean, I'm starting to sound a little paranoid there, but yeah, definitely when you have two wires, pay attention. Put one on each side of the clamp. Don't put them in the same hole. I guess that's what I'm remembering. I was trying to think what was some of the problems I saw. If people aren't paying attention and they want to bring two wires to this tie point, they put them both in this side. Now you really have overloaded the clamping action, and it tends to really skew it, and it's not as good. So yeah. Anyway, simple thing again, but. I think maybe the bottom line when I think about all this simple stuff that seems like common sense, but it's just little things you want to not miss. And it always reminds me of just the general statement: just pay attention to what you're doing. You know, don't just tune out while you're doing stuff. Be watching, be feeling. You know, the screw tension. You know, what is the torque, even if you don't have a torque driver, you know. So be aware of that. I mean, there's lots of times where a student will have problems with his with his wiring, what he's trying to make, and turns out maybe there were just too many that weren't really even tightened down, you know. So, you know, give it a decent amount of tightening. And maybe one last thing, we do have clamps that can come in, and again, I don't think I have them with me, but you can put a clamp on either side of this, and maybe don't use the little screwdriver for that. The screws are a little heavier, but they're right down the middle. And what that clamp does is it grabs onto the DIN rail, and it'll just firm up both sides of this. It'll pinch these together and clamp them. Maybe I can find a clamp, I'll see. But that's nice to have, because let me see if I can demonstrate. Sometimes if you're wiring these things up, you can, well, I think you can see, right? If I'm turning on this, let me get all the way down to where I actually have some torque that I need to apply. So there I am, and you can see I'm there, and now I'm just going to torque to put a little tension on those threads, and watch. I mean, the whole thing's twisting, you know, so that's not so great, right? I mean, so the clamps on either side, when you have a block of terminal blocks all assembled how you want them, you usually do clamp them in place, and then you can torque down all the different tie points, and you're not like stressing out the plastic, you know, twisting it this way, that way. I did find a terminal block. It's a little bit small, but I think you can still see that. I wanted to show you the spring type clamping action on some. Now this one here is actually 3 tie points, and you would put your wire down through here, and this is the little bit of spring steel here, or whatever it is, that will take your wire and pin it against the contact here. So what you have to do is, you would have your wire at the ready down here, and there's no way for it to fit in there, but until you have your screwdriver. You can see the top side. Here's where you would put in your screwdriver to release, to get some room for that wire. So you're going to put your screwdriver in there and push over. Can you see it moving? It's small. I wish I had a bigger one, but I'm moving that spring over. When I move the spring over, I can slide the wire down in. Hang on, I'll get a wire. We can actually do it. Just a second. All right, we can try this to see if it'll work with the 22 gauge wire that I have. All terminal blocks, they'll have all these specifications. They'll have torque specifications if they're screws. They'll have strip length, for the wire. I mean, you can see, and they'll have gauge, what gauge wire they can work with. So, I mean, I can see for this strip length. I mean, again, I'm gonna put my wire down in here, and again, it kind of disappears from sight, so you kind of have to know what's going on. But if you had it stripped too long, I mean, it's going to bottom out here, hit that, and be sticking out and so on. So I mean, but they have all those specifications for somebody putting together a whole wiring harness or something. I mean, they would already have the wires stripped all to the right length for whatever terminal block they're going to be put into. And top side here, you can see what it looks like. I mean, you basically have your insert points for your wire, and this is how, there's no screw to torque down. It's just this lever action that you have to accomplish. So they're also fast. I mean, I forgot about that advantage. I mean, I like them because vibration isn't going to make something like a screw come loose. But I think they also call these quick wire sometimes, you know, because they are fast. Let me see if I can have enough hands to do this. So under the camera, I don't know if 22 gauge is too thick or not to get in here. So let's just see. So I got that pushed open, and I kind of have it in there. Oops, I got a little strand out. So that wasn't great. I would probably, hey, there's another advantage of Ferrules, right? You don't have the little whiskers of wire that come splintering off. Did you see when I was trying to manage this under the camera, and kind of a little difficult to do. I mean, I got whiskers popping out all over the place. Chalk up another pro in the for Ferrules. You don't have any whiskering random strands flying around. But and the same thing, I mean, you can release that wire, right? I mean, that's not a big deal, right? You just release it. I mean, if I did that poor of a job, I'd probably redo it, you know, twist those strands back together. But, you know, so you get the idea, I think. But yeah, it's just a little tricky to do, holding on to the, it's easier when these things are already popped on, already on the DIN rail and clamped in place. I'm trying to do it with me holding it. There we go. So there it is. You can see I've pushed it over, and I can put the wire in, then I release it, right, and it should hold on pretty good. Never be afraid to pull on the wire that you just terminated or made the connection for. I mean, whether it's a wire nut, you know, if you're doing electrical work or something with wire nuts, or a terminal block, I always give them a tug. And some people, you know, I know maybe there's a tendency, people are like, I don't want to pull on it. What if it comes out and then I'll have to do it again? Guess what? If it comes out of the wire nut, or if it pulls loose, you needed to do it again, and you just saved yourself a lot of headaches down the road. So never hesitate to give it a tug. I mean, I'm pulling pretty strongly on that, and I can see, yeah, it's good. I have confidence, you know. So I always do that to wires, no matter what I'm terminating. That they're meant for that. I mean, obviously don't go crazy, but a good firm tug to make sure that it's what you think it is. Sometimes with students wiring, you know, you can. It sounds silly, but I mean, you can find the problem quite easily. Sometimes on our PLC projects and stuff, I just go down combing through the wires, and if anything comes loose, well, there you go. And the thing is, it's on more than one occasion, it's been like combing through wires, and more than one, you know, comes loose. You know, it's like their wiring is shedding. You know, it's just coming off in my bare hands without even pulling hard. Just kind of comb through it loosely, and 3 or 4 wires pop out of the supposedly clamped terminal. So yeah, so it happens. I've seen it a lot, but yeah, just make sure you got a good snug connection no matter what, whether it's clamps or threads. Okay, I think that should cover it for something like this. If I think of something else, I'll throw it in a different video.